Hi, I'm Rachael Carver, and I'm going to be talking about how should risks be communicated to volcano tourists. Here's a brief summary of what you can expect from this session. So what is volcano tourism? Volcano tourism involves the exploration and study of active and dormant volcanic and geothermal landforms. It is becoming increasingly popular following recent volcanic eruptions and is extremely important as it supports local, regional, national, and international economies. This research investigated how do tourists perceive volcanic hazards, what influence does social media have on volcano tourism, especially as this research into this field is in its infancy, and finally, most importantly, how should risks be communicated to volcano tourists? A mixed research methods approach was used. Questionnaires and semi-structured interviews were used to assess how tourists perceive volcanic hazards and how risks should be communicated to volcano tourists. A social media study was conducted by collecting social media posts from volcano tourists, researchers, and hazard monitoring agencies to assess how social media is influencing volcano tourism. This data was then analysed using statistical analysis and coded using grounded theory. So how do tourists perceive volcanic hazards? Well, tourists have a reasonably accurate perception of volcanic hazards. Pyroclastic density currents, lahars, and tsunamis were identified as the most hazardous volcanic phenomenon in that order. If you look on the table on the right from Brown et al. 2017, you can see that pyroclastic density currents, tsunamis, and lahars were identified as three of the most deadliest volcanic phenomena, with tsunami being proportionally the most deadliest. Suggesting that they have a reasonably good, accurate perception of volcanic hazards. And this is further supported by tourists identifying lightning as the least hazardous phenomena. Understanding of volcanic hazards has a significant influence on tourist perceptions of volcanic hazards, meaning tourists who have a good understanding of volcanic hazards are more likely to have an accurate perception of volcanic hazards. So what influence does social media have on volcano tourism? I identified four key areas. Firstly, marketing, both directly through organisations and indirectly through tourists sharing their experiences on social media and marketing. Secondly is through sharing experiences. Tourists post pictures of them in volcanic environments next to volcanoes to gain social recognitions with friends, family, and colleagues. Thirdly, it's been increasingly used in education research. Researchers use social media to market their research, but locals and researchers and hazard monitoring agencies also use it to educate tourists about activity at volcanoes and volcanic hazards. And recently, it's been increasingly used in risk communication. And this is a growing area of hazard management. But it's important to acknowledge that using social media for risk communication is not uniform across the globe. It tends to be focused on areas where they have official monitoring agencies that are using social media to provide quick alerts and updates to people in the area about changes in a volcano's behaviour or volcanic environments. Finally, how should risks be communicated to volcano tourists? A two-phase mixed method approach should be used where multiple methods of risk communication should be made available prior to a tourist arrival to a volcanic environment and during their visit. Tourists have a difficulty understanding the risks from some volcanic hazards, so comparing risks from volcanic hazards to everyday hazards as highlighted by previous researchers is extremely important, especially, for example, comparing the risk of all volcanic hazards to any type of road accident. Hazard maps and hazard signs should incorporate colour theory, so using yellow to represent caution and hazard, red to represent danger, do not proceed. It should use dyslexic friendly fonts. It should use symbols and text, especially as people visiting volcanic environments are not likely to be from one country or speak just one language. They're likely to speak several languages. Social media should be used, however, it should come from official sources like monitoring agencies, and there also needs to be caution paid to fake news and fake social media. Finally, safety briefings should be used particularly by tour guides taking tourists out into volcanic environments, and they should be appropriately dressed for the environment, as this builds trust and helps tourists to pay more attention to the information they're providing about safety. So recommendations for future research: we need to assess who is responsible for volcano tourist safety. Research has already highlighted that both tourists, tourism operators, and authorities are responsible for tourist safety. However, the degrees and the extent to which who is responsible for what amount of safety is not well known. It's poorly understood, and further research needs to clarify this, especially following White Island. We need to improve collaboration between researchers, tourism operators, monitoring agencies, and local governments to improve risk communication. And we need to incorporate advances in technology into risk communication strategies and continuously develop low-cost, effective risk communication strategies. And we need to adapt existing risk communication strategies to meet the needs of different social, economic, environmental, and political backgrounds. So to conclude, tourists have a reasonably accurate perception of volcanic hazards. Social media influences volcano tourism through marketing, sharing experiences, education, research, risk communication. And a two-phase mixed method approach prior to arrival and during a visit to volcanic environments should incorporate social media, hazard maps, hazard signs, safety briefings, government websites, and others. I would like to acknowledge Professor Nigel Clark for supervising this research, Hans Saini for very kindly providing me with some images to use in this presentation, all the participants who were involved in the interviews, distribution and completion of questionnaires. Thank you for listening.